Hey Next Economy Now listeners, we're so excited to share with you that we've officially opened registration for our fall cohort of the Next Economy MBA, which begins on September 17th. Our team created this course for listeners like you, the entrepreneurs, artists, community leaders, and other folks on the front lines of the Next Economy movement. Based on our 15 years of experience working with 300 different social enterprises, our 9-month facilitated cohort will provide you with a supportive co-learning community. Together, we'll explore the pitfalls of the business-as-usual economy, explore key business principles from a regenerative and just perspective, all while fostering the community and connection we need to stay resilient, inspired, and motivated in our movement for global change. If this sounds like it might be useful for you or a member of your community, we invite you to join us for one of our upcoming indoor sessions on June 11th, July 23rd, August 8th, or August 20th. Plus, you can save 20% when you register for the course before July 29th. Get started at lifteconomy.com/MBA. Thanks for listening, and now on to the show.
Hi, this is Kevin Bayuk of Lift Economy, and this is an episode of Next Economy Now. And it is my honor and really a distinct privilege to introduce and to have a conversation with somebody that I can classify as maybe it's a little vulnerable or embarrassing, but as a hero. Somebody I've learned a tremendous amount from, both in the written word, and then I had the enormous privilege to learn in person. Early in this century, and somebody who I believe has truly actually impacted the world, which I can say about very few people. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce David Holmgren.
Pleased to be on the Next Economy.
Thanks, David. I think when people typically introduce you, they probably introduce you as the co-originator of the permaculture concept. And,
Yep.
And when I think about the Next Economy Now audience, it's maybe there's some of us who are not yet aware of what permaculture is. And though I'm sure you've addressed this 1,000 times, I'm wondering if you would do us the favor of introducing permaculture in your own words.
Yeah. Permaculture is, in essence, a design system for both sustainable living and land use. So it's concerned with both the consumption side of the equation, how we behave, how we organise ourselves in our living arrangements, our economic arrangements, and also the production side of where actually humanity gets its basic material energetic needs, which is from essentially a working relationship with nature. Whether that is a dysfunctional relationship or not, that's where wealth, that's where what we need comes from. And in a lot of ways, it's about bringing those two sides of that separate realities back together again. So when we grow food for ourselves in our gardens, rather than going to the supermarket, we are pulling back together that consumption production system into one looped cyclical system. And that requires, or has at least the opportunity to apply design thinking, which we can think of as a sort of like a new emergent literacy of humanity. Now, clearly, traditional systems before the modern era did involve design. When we look back, we can see the evolutionary design, but that's a very sort of slow process. And in the 20th century, design as a sort of like a new literacy started to show some of its potential. And so I see permaculture emerging in the 1970s as part of that design revolution of consciously, how do we put these things together? So the starting point for that for Bill Mollison and myself was around the questions of agriculture, because agriculture is actually the primary activity, human activity on the planet. It's actually the most environmentally and resource problematic one. Relatively recent recognition of that in the, the greenhouse metrics of carbon emissions, that agriculture is still this big thing, and especially when you look at it as the whole food supply chain. So a lot of people would associate permaculture, of course, as some sort of cool form of organic gardening, because permaculture has brought together a lot of techniques from a spectrum of sources, from traditional and indigenous ways of doing things to innovative ideas in the 20th century, that we'd associate with organic agriculture and gardening, but also then spreading out in related areas of intentional communities, designed communities, which of experimentation at the fringes of affluent societies in the 70s, around the same time permaculture was developing. So it sort of really means different things to different people, but stepping back even a bit further, you could put it in a sort of a spectrum, one part of the spectrum of positive environmentalism, trying to create the world we want, rather than negative environmentalism, not in the sense that that's bad, but trying to push back or stop bad things happening in the world. But its focus, instead of being at how do we change government policies or make the latest green corporation, that its focus has been at, if you like, at the grassroots in a communitarian sense, but also right down at the household and the individual level. How do we actually live the change we want to see in the world, be that, and sort of use the freedom and opportunity that the modern world provides to create a parallel world that has a chance of providing some learnings for society, maybe right back to the idea of being lifeboats in the case of that main society pushing itself further over the cliff, as it seems to be doing, so that rather than trying to reform the large scale set, things start again at the bottom. And in that sense of childhood development, learning to crawl before we walk, before we run. So what does this new world look like that later became called sustainability, more than a decade after permaculture? I suppose the other way to think about permaculture, of course, is that it's actually now a worldwide movement and network of people and organisations, and not just confined to the affluent countries of the world. In many poorer countries, there's quite strong permaculture networks, and mostly we'd associate those with organic agriculture, intentional communities, ecological building, those sorts of networks, but also spreading out into the peer-to-peer, new economy sort of areas. And I mean, just as an example of a connection in that particular area, back in the 1980s, when permaculture activists first started becoming involved in ethical investment in Australia, ethical investment was about not investing in tobacco companies and arms trading. With the influence of permaculture activists, it became about investing in positive environmental solutions, which actually started with an organisation called August Investments, which became Australian Ethical Investment, which is actually the largest ethical investment fund in the country. So permaculture has had a connection to, I suppose, the economic side, from early days as well as more recently.
Right, and I think in that case, that's one of permaculture's connections to the formal economy, and I think highlighting that at this personal and household scale of action, there's whole realms that we could still associate with the word economy, in terms of this producer consumer, bringing that closer together, where we are locally self-reliant, like meeting our own needs. Um, how do you connect your insights and observations about the economy at large, the formal economy, in terms of how it motivates some of your thinking around, maybe even why suburbia and why retrofit and some of the things that have come up recently? And I guess for those who are listening, I should mention, and I'll put it in the resources, very recently, within the last year, David has published a book, RetroSuburbia, The Downshifter's Guide to a Resilient Future. And I'll put a link where that can be available. It's a tremendous, tremendous work. And I'll let you kind of describe a little bit about that connection, maybe.
Yeah, well, I suppose RetroSuburbia is really coming out of a lineage of nearly 20 years work that in the late 90s, teaching on permaculture design courses and thinking about the framing of the future that permaculture was based on in the 70s, the evidence of the limits to growth, the idea that complex industrial civilization was not going to keep growing at 2% per annum, just didn't comply with the laws of physics or, the possibilities of mathematical exponential growth, and understanding what are the different ways in which that could come to an end. And so that led to, as we approached the millennium, and there was evidence that we're approaching both the climate crisis and the resources crisis through the agency of peak oil, primarily limits to the energies that had actually sustained society, and the adverse consequences of those energies, primarily in the form of climate change, but species extinction and a myriad of other consequences, a lot of them relating to agriculture, of course, that those limits meant it was really important to think about what sort of economic systems could actually make that transition, and whether that transition would be in an ordered, planned way or more chaotic ways. And of course, because we've moved on so much from the 1970s, 1972, when the Limits to Growth report came out, we've mostly gone radically in the wrong direction. And so all of those problems that were very clear back then that were going to emerge very strongly, according to the modelling in the mid-21st century, are actually sort of, we're in them already. So that meant that humanity, one way or another, is going to adapt to what I called an energy descent future, if not an energy collapse future, and using energy as a sort of a marker of the underlying real source of wealth that sustains humanity, not just in the sense of fuel that you put in your car or electricity that you run your computer with, but energy in the larger ecological sense, that in various forms, all systems that grow depend on a growing supply of energy. There isn't one that doesn't. With those understandings, it became clear that the vast residential landscapes of suburbia in affluent countries like the United States and Australia that had been, I suppose, regarded by planners and environmentalists for decades as the lost landscapes, the dysfunctional landscapes, the ones dependent on commuting and that were dormitory suburbs, and all of these negative things. They're all true, that these landscapes actually had huge potential for incremental retrofit and re-ruralisation for energy descent futures, where we would have to be more locally self-reliant. So that was sort of like that larger framing that was always there at the beginnings of permaculture, but became a stronger part of my work. But it got sidelined a little as I focused on the future scenarios side of that equation. So in 2007, we put out a website, Future Scenarios, which became a book in 2009, where I suggested that peak oil and climate change were the big drivers of multiple potential energy descent scenarios that would in some way involve a world of less rather than a world of more. And so using that future scenarios framework of scenario planning, how do you adapt and flexibly respond to, how those might emerge? And I suppose it was after that work that I came back to the suburban context, but there was a lot of work that was continuing in that, including my Aussie Street Story, which is sort of a permaculture soap opera of people adapting in situ in suburbia and surviving and thriving through what's a near future scenario of the Second Great Depression of the 2020s. So that's of course a story in a chapter in the RetroSuburbia book, but it's a storytelling that I've been doing for more than a decade, which has been, I found, a more creative and engaging way to talk about a lot of those issues. So I think that uncertainty about the future and what is the aspects of the future that we can't negotiate away or are unlikely to be negotiated away, and then how do we respond creatively to those? What are the limits of human agency individually and right through to globally? And I suppose there's still that debate is hugely raging, and it illustrates the commitment to growth in materials and energy and economic expression is, very, very strongly at a sort of a religious faith. It's and it keeps sort of re-emerging in different forms. And of course, permaculture from the beginning, and certainly with RetroSuburbia, it's more a creative, positive response to that possibility of and likelihood of energy descent in some form. And I use the term descent rather than collapse, because I think, in spite of the incredibly good work by economic and ecological historians on collapse of previous civilizations and the implications for our own, the word collapse does imply the complete sort of ending of something. And I think that's not exactly the most likely path. And I think it's very interesting that the one that we understand the most of historically, the Rome, was actually described as a decline, a sort of a gradual unraveling of empire and gradual replacement with other structures, of course, with crises along the way. So in that sense, I am, I suppose, one of those thinkers who's spent a lifetime thinking about how do we work in that environment of less, and recognise that there's then an alignment once you do that from an ecological, energetic, economic point of view, with a lot of the spiritual traditions of our own culture and traditional peoples who always recognized the limits of the material world and said the place where growth can continue is in the internal, the spiritual, the awareness domain. That's where growth is always good. But the growth always ends in the material world. You know, the growth of anything comes to an end. So in some ways, that awareness of limits is also a redirecting towards a pathway of internal growth. And that's not necessarily in a completely sort of private, internalized, personal thing. It's in a societal sense too, a shift from materialism really to being in other ways, if that's not too esoteric.
To being, yeah. I'm struck by the agency of humans in the context is potentially another motivator for personal voluntary behavior change where we have agency. I found in my work using permaculture design that work on a personal and household scale as the distinct accent and emphasis doesn't necessarily preclude at all advocating for or acting for transformation of larger systems, the government or community scale, that these two things can be potentially both and. I'm curious if, I mean, you mentioned permaculture's connection to the world of formal economy, ethical investing. It's just an example, maybe not transformative, but certainly from a harm reduction perspective of the enormity of the power of the economy to shape the harms in this world.
Yeah, well, I think the important thing of modeling, if we are talking about radical structural change rather than just reform of these slight, collateral damage created by industrial civilization and its main sort of mechanism of organization through capitalism, then that to do that in saying we are going to restructure this from the top is a recipe for disaster, because we're talking about actually how something organically grows, and it's got to grow from simple examples, because in nature and human systems, any complex system that works evolved from simple systems that worked. No complex system that was sort of like created from scratch ever worked. And I think this is true with right through to a lot of discussions about even physical systems like the electricity grid and the internet are the two most complex physical systems that humans have ever created, and they weren't actually designed from scratch. They evolved. So this thing of how do we model what does some sort of deeper form of sustainability or adaptability to ecological and energetic realities look like? Well, you start at the base. And for me, the basic economic unit of society, which is self-evident and is often not even bothered to be mentioned, is a household. Now, whether that's a family of related people, in some sort of traditional sense, or not, that is the basic unit of where things are provided. Now, it's difficult in the modern world to sort of even recognise that, because we've shunted most activity out of the household up into higher levels of economic organisation and complexity, and mostly monetarised those. But even in affluent societies, the work of feminist economist Marilyn Waring showed in countries like New Zealand and Australia, the unpaid work of women way back in the 80s was so much that if it was paid, it would send those countries bankrupt. So even in modern societies, that household activity is where a lot of basic things get done. Looking after children, preparing food, fixing a leaking tap, a myriad of things, even when we're not considering really what we would say self-reliant householders who grow their own food and, bake their own bread and milk goats and, remanufacture bicycle parts or, do a myriad of things for themselves. So I've been suggesting in my presentation of the RetroSuburbia ideas, and it's a sort of a challenge out to economic researchers, the idea that my guess is that 50% of the growth in GDP in my lifetime, over 60 years or so, has been completely fake. So not in the sense that legal litigation or car accidents contribute to GDP, bads and disservices, but in the sense that those activities were already happening. They just weren't monetarised. So, for example, when someone stopped making their lunch at home and bought it at work, no more lunches were created. It's just that the activity became monetarised. It moved out of the household economy and into the monetary economy. Okay, we can look at the lunch that was being made in the household economy, and in most places in the modern world it was made from bought ingredients. But at least the service component of making the lunch was not part of the monetary economy. But it was still there as a value to those individual people and to society. So if we've done that move, and that a lot of what we call economic growth that's all it is, then if it's more environmentally efficient, socially beneficial, and creates greater economic autonomy for people to move some of that activity back into the household and community non-monetary economies of exchange.
Certainly more resilient.
Yeah, we can do that and call it economic growth, which makes me pro-growth.
That's a spin I haven't heard yet. I haven't heard that turn on it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think so many of the economic arguments just really, really need to be broken down and seen in through a completely different lens. And this is, I suppose, the core idea that should be really simple, but I think is often ignored, that the household is an economic system, but our households are weaker, more fragile, and ironically, too small to be very self-reliant on average. Yeah. Too few people living together. And that then leads to, I think, two responses without even being aware of that sort of, having been sucked dry and everything shunted into the monetary economy. Who benefited from that? So, and of course there's huge challenges in this, because one of the biggest ways in which that happened was women moving from the household economy into the workforce. And so that process that most of us understand as part of gender equality and all of these positive aspects of that, maybe that actually happened. The biggest forces behind that were really that this is a way to keep growing GDP. And not necessarily in some conspiratorial sense, but that
It's the mandate of capitalism.
Yeah, that everyone must be in this system because that's how the system can grow. So as well as the expansion of the fringes in terms of economic colonization and new forms of colonial economy, and of course the colonization of the future in terms of over-extraction of resources and all of those sorts of things, you've got this internal colonization of the territory that was not controlled by governments and corporations and banks, and it's just what people did for themselves. And so that didn't require a sort of a monetary measure. So in most societies before very recently, a vast amount of what we would call economic activity was at the household level, and for very good reasons, because it's actually just more efficient to grow vegetables, for example, right where people live, and that not be part of a monetary system. Doesn't mean to say that everyone doing that is the most efficient expert person, but people did that because they kept money for the things that they couldn't do for themselves, and whether that was going to the doctor or some, higher, more complex functions. And what we know through economic history in the modern world is whenever there's a downturn in the monetary economy, we get a resurgence in these household and community non-monetary economies. And we get it whether people like it or not. It happens.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what RetroSuburbia and even larger permaculture is about doing that well. How can we do that well? Because it's going to be done anyway. And it gives this enormous capacity for both resilience to uncertain shocks in systems, but it also gives a degree of political autonomy that is incredibly lacking today. And a lot of people advocating for radical political change don't seem to understand that most people in the modern world are virtually dependent almost on the air they breathe on a system that has power over them. So some degree of household and community autonomy, self-organising autonomy, is also one of the foundations of any sort of, political equity. And, so those, connect over into, these very large issues that, but of course, RetroSuburbia as a book is not about that. It's about the patterns of that actually work for people doing these things, because my intention with the book was to help enable people doing these things rather than write the book about the theory and the framework and all those sorts of things.
And it's very comprehensive. Let's pause for a moment on RetroSuburbia, because it's not, there's a preamble that does give the general framing, and you admittedly don't go to the layer of detail that some permaculture literature goes to, like specifying certain vegetation selection, even though there's great recommendations for the climate zones identified. But it's really the pattern level. It's this design level for this intentional retrofit, so making it possible to be less haphazard as we kind of voluntarily develop these resilient households and connected resilient households into resilient neighborhoods. As much as I'd love to query you about babacos and some of our favorite fruits and vegetables and so forth. It's not necessarily that layer of detail, though. If there's a reader out there that wanted that layer of detail, there is enough there to satisfy. Especially, I found the soil and soil toxicity stuff very additive to my existing understanding and experience. As an example.
Yeah. We certainly went into within the three fields that the book covers. In some ways, it's several commentators have said it's really three books: the built environment, the biological, and the behavioural. The behavioural is actually the biggest section, but the one that people would most strongly associate with permaculture is the biological and food production systems. And we see food production as certainly the core of what is possible in the suburban scale household economies. In higher density city environments, then yes, there's still a role for the household economy. It's smaller than at the suburban level, which you could say is smaller than at the rural level. But there's sort of a different proportionate focus in those three fields of action. And growing food is certainly one of the powerful ways in which households can become more self-reliant, provide for more of their own needs. And it's also the place where the household becomes an incubator for potential future generation monetary economic activity. So the child who starts with a passion for, raising seedlings or whatever, and gets into producing something and then is developing a small, backyard enterprise, that the way in which the household economy is literally this nursery for future monetary activity, rather than the idea that monetary activity starts from some sort of rational search just by investors and entrepreneurs as to what market needs. More the idea of economy coming from a passion thing of people who do something really well and discovering they can and want to do that for other people. So the diversity of a resilient household economies for children especially, seeing lots of different models and lots of different niches in which they can experiment.
Yeah.
And some of that is not copying actually the adults, it's actually finding the vacant niche, in the same way that our son in the workshop didn't copy me as a wood crafts person. By the time he was 15, became a much better welder than me. And became the metal worker. So finding that vacant niche, and the trouble is in most modern households, it's a very, very simple, crude, fragile ecosystem, and there aren't many niches to sort of to occupy. And the potential we see in suburbia is there's a sweet point between the space and resources for autonomy and self-provision that we associate with rural areas, combined with the critical mass of population and connectedness for interaction and exchange that we associate with cities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that potential, despite the dysfunction of the way it's been designed and lived in, is still there in suburbia to be exploited and developed in ways that don't require the whole of society to come to some agreement that this is necessary.
Yeah. So
whereas in urban areas, especially in higher density apartment buildings and others, there are so many stakeholders that have all got to get on board before something can shift, that it's very hard for household and individual level to sort of get action, which is why most of that creative action then goes out into network systems in the community, and there's been more action at that level, whether that's through community gardens or different forms of co-ops and different types of creative new economic activity, because where people live, and often in the physical systems, is sort of like all locked down.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's more technically complicated. You
Sure.
know, how do we retrofit a 10-story apartment building with incredibly complex electrical and plumbing and communication systems for an energy descent future? Yes, it can be done, but it's much more technically complicated than how do we retrofit a single-story building and grow food in a backyard. So that's why we see that sweet point in suburbia.
Right, it's something about the settlement pattern with if there's enough density. So I thought it was provocative. You mentioned it earlier. Just having enough people in the household is part of the retrofit. Is actually in many cases maybe increasing density or at least increasing household activity and presence.
This plays into one of the big sort of beliefs in the planning profession and the environment movement generally, that for cities to be sustainable, we need more density, and that the suburban density is too low. And that's been sort of an orthodoxy ever since I was at, design school, where we came up with the permaculture idea in the 70s. But it's based on a fallacy that effectively a cargo cult, that to get that density, if we assume more density is needed, we put up more buildings. And we've done that. And what has actually happened is density of number of people per square kilometre has actually not changed.
Right. That's the sprawl phenomenon. Yeah.
Well, what's happened is that the number of people living in those houses.
I see.
Down.
Yeah, I see.
So we've done infill. Yes, of course, suburbs have continued to sprawl at the fringe. We've infilled the existing suburbs, and we've put up towers at the centre. So we've done all of that. But actually, the number of people per square kilometre, short of real high-rise development, has in a lot of places not actually increased.
Mm-hmm.
We know that from data in the city where we're closest to in Melbourne. So 30 years of infill development hasn't increased the average population density. So you would think there would be a questioning of maybe this infill development doesn't work. So what has actually gone on? Well, families are now smaller, households are now smaller, and all of that means there's fewer people with more floor area per person, full of stuff. But that's only a little bit of the equation, because the hours of occupancy is something that we can't sort of really get any data on. But what we know anecdotally and in experience is that people are spending less and less time at home, until fairly recently at least, and that activity has all moved off into the public space, into the commercial world.
Yeah.
So whether it's at the restaurant or the dog shampoo service or the gymnasium or at work or school, or everything is out there, which makes us experience cities as being crowded.
Right.
So there's this existential angst about like cities being packed with people, but they're actually not. Most of the buildings are empty at any one time.
Right.
And of course, this is how GDP growth has been constantly expanded. So as well as building the houses, extra floor area per person, we've also built all of this other stuff, so there's as well as the toilet you use at home, there's the toilet in the gymnasium and the restaurant and all of these other things in the commercial economy. So far greater growth. So what that really means is that the effective density in terms of hours of occupation is a tiny fraction. Yeah. So I did a little bit of an experiment on this, modelling our own occupation of our self-reliant, almost suburban scale homestead here at Meliadora over the last 30 years, and doing it with a spreadsheet and looking at hours of occupancy and the people who work in the office and the volunteers who come here and all the different bits and pieces, and then comparing it to a typical suburban household with a couple both working full-time and 3 kids going to school, and the different holidays and activities. And I was a bit surprised that we're only at about double the household occupancy. So that meant that our house of 30 years old was actually 60 years old in terms of its use, which is interesting in itself, this use of buildings, how much buildings are being actively used, or whether they're just sitting there as an asset, which in theory is just rising in value. Because, of course, without that rise in value, that imaginary rise in value, it's the use value of something which is important economically. But it was interesting when I modelled the kitchen, where we make all our own bread and bake cakes for people who come on tours and provide food for people who work and do all our own bottling and processing. I worked out that the kitchen was 300 years old in terms of a typical suburban kitchen. So there's a whole lot of ways of looking at the whole urban planning, urban development, economic development sort of matrix that are not really being considered in a lot of these conventional discussions. And so our strategies, like encouraging people to take in a boarder, take in someone into your house to share the house as the most thing you can do that's good for the community, good for the environment, good for your own household resilience and the financial circumstances. Is, how come that isn't a strategy of a political party or a government or community advocacy? Now, of course, if our houses were all full of people, that might be more difficult. So if we tell people, the 15 people in the Soweto taxi, that they should put 30 people in the Soweto taxi, it's a little bit difficult. Whereas when we look at cars in countries like Australia and the United States, we can quadruple the energy efficiency of the engine by, 4 people in the car. So that process of how we get to use what we've already got. And obviously there's in a lot of innovation in the sharing economies that is being talked about. But we forget often that the model for how we do this and how children learn how to do all this stuff is actually in a household. And so when we try and create all these things anew in a monetary economy, they might be good, they might be a bit the icing on the cake, but we need to put a lot more energy into rebuilding our household as foundational economic systems. And in doing that, that also reaches across that widening economic and ideological gulf in societies like the United States and Australia, between those of progressive thinking on the left and people on the other side of that divide who don't perhaps think in the same way, but actually on a lot of these issues there could be a lot of common ground, a lot of understanding, and we're getting a tendency for these things to be not to see some of these solutions because they might actually involve an acknowledgement of some truth or value in people who see things on the other side of that world, which is obviously, perhaps a stronger divide tearing at countries like the United States, even Australia. So RetroSuburbia is, really challenging a lot of orthodox thinking, not just in the conventional top systems, but looking at our own values and how we do things, and also recreating a lot of what some people have called nanotechnology, grandmother technology, simple ways of doing things.
And again, the theme, what some of these themes here are patterns, this, capitalism with its mandates for increasing monetization and monetary transactions as its measure of success or even sustenance, seeps in and erodes the diversity of expressions and even vocational calling for people to explore what they're most interested in. And we find some of these themes of the behavior field, like you mentioned, is the largest part of the book, which can apply that's almost independent a bit of there's pieces of it that are in the sweet spot in the suburban context, but the behavioral field, I've always seen it as something that's applicable, whether it's in an urban density or even in a rural kind of setting.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, it's a lot of that is sort of, you could say, what characterizes it. It relates to modern, long, affluent context, rather than people who are at the other end of the scale in the world economy, who are still living in traditional villages and still connected into a lot of things that, ironically, we need to sort of relearn some of the things about raising self-reliant and resilient children, those sorts of issues that there are still places in the world, and in fact, many of those things that we've said in the book that are controversial in many places in the world, they'd be just self-evident common sense and not need to be talked about at all.
Actually, I was going to ask about that. Just when you think about the third ethic, this of permaculture, for those who are listening, the permaculture has an explicit set of ethics, which is one of the distinctions as a design system from some of the other design systems with their own rhetoric. Permaculture has a very explicit set of ethics, and the third ethic is typically described as placing voluntary limits to consumption and reproduction. And this idea of voluntary limits, I think, is key. But what I was going to ask about that is, it's common for me to hear when thinking about the ethics and thinking about permanent settlement or permaculture or a long-standing continuous human community or settlement, is this idea of, is permaculture itself a form of cultural appropriation from indigenous peoples who, with their lifeways that have developed from their lived experience over time in place. And I'm just curious if you could respond to what sometimes comes as a critique, or at least a question about permaculture in that regard.
Well, I think to some extent, permaculture is, if we just use the words in neutral sense, cultural appropriation. The thing about it is, it's whether that is transparent and acknowledged or not. And I think certainly from the beginnings, working with Mollison, one of the things he had done at the time I met him was actually did the work on the lineage of the Tasmanian Aborigines presumed to be extinct, which actually led to people of that descent being recognised by the Australian government as actually being Aboriginal, whereas before that work they didn't exist officially. And at that time, he knew most of those people in the Tasmanian community personally, and but we're also discussing the ways in which Indigenous systems were actually a model for permaculture, because there's two primary models for permaculture. One was nature itself. What are the rules, design rules and patterns of natural systems, and how do we use those as templates? And the second was those of long, sustainable, traditional and indigenous land use systems and patterns. And in Permaculture 1, those things are completely referenced. And so the degree to which permaculture is also common sense, often just people from a rural, more self-reliant backgrounds, when permaculture is explained to them, they would sometimes say to me, isn't a lot of that just common sense? And I would say, yes, quite a lot of it, not all of it, but it's no longer common. And so it actually needs to be relearned, rediscovered. So to some extent, there is a sort of like permaculture could be thought of through one lens as remedial holistics for people who've come through the dysfunction of the affluent world. Because as the world changes, of course, find that a lot of the advantages that world has provided actually fall away, and that people who appear to be at a disadvantage in that world, who have practical skills, for example, who can see the environment around them as a source of sustenance. So, of course, this is, for some people in the modern world, they look to indigenous people in the most remote parts of the world saying, oh, yes, they have that esoteric almost knowledge of seeing the world around them as a source of sustenance. And that's true to some degree, and it is incredibly important, the efforts to sort of try and protect people who are at that level still connected to land in that ancient and continuing way. But there's also a connection to our own recent history, even our own grandparents and great-grandparents, of the way they saw things. Because ironically, there may be more in common with the way they saw things and the most ancient indigenous culture in the world than there is between our own great-grandparents and ourselves. The modern world has just so fractured those things. So what some people would critique as, oh, that's appropriating sort of deep sort of ancestral cultural knowledge. Sometimes it's actually, no, just appropriating what our own ancestors did. And it's interesting to look at the differences, for example, in the early colonisation of the United States, which was pre-industrial, and the colonisation of Australia, that the people who came to Australia were already the cast-offs of the first truly industrial civilization on the planet. So people who came out here didn't actually know how to grow food because they were from urban industrial cities that had lost their connection to the countryside. They were didn't understand Aboriginal indigenous landscape and management, not just because it was very foreign to Europe, but because they were uneducated, illiterate people growing up in smog-choked early industrial cities in the worst living conditions imaginable. So they'd lost their own cultural lineage, their own connection to land. And so they, in that sense, they were like a prototype of modern people. Now, clearly, a whole lot of advantages came through that process to people, and those advantages have accrued in the parts of the world which have long been affluent, the places that were industrialised first, and the problems or the disadvantages have been outsourced or pushed to the fringes. So understanding all of those structures of exploitation are incredibly important and inform permaculture all the time. But in the same way that permaculture makes use of plants from all around the world, because the world has now been mixed biologically in the same way that it's been mixed culturally, that whatever industrialization has done, there's been this one-way process which is like continents colliding into each other at that geological scale of mixing biology, mixing cultures in ways that will never be pulled back out, other than through a long energy descent future where, again, local cultures, local languages, local ecologies end up redeveloping, which could take thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. So that relocalization process does, over time, will create new cultures of place. It's inevitable. But at the moment, we are in this great sort of mixed whirlpool, and everywhere, this is the case. So we make use of what is relevant, but we should always be acknowledging lineage. Where did that come from? Where was the source of that? And certainly there's an aspect in the permaculture movement, like all movements, where people tend to act like, they received these ideas down from some single source, and, it doesn't have any precedence, or, that Holmgren and Mollison sort of created all this out of thin air. And it's been very important for me to always, acknowledge sources, in the same way that the lineage of the ideas of organic agriculture that began in the modern world as a reaction to the early phases of industrial agriculture in the 1930s, independently in Britain, Germany, the United States, and actually in Japan. We now know that these lineages were sort of part of the wellspring that permaculture has built on. So there's lineages and sources, it's very important to sort of recognise those things, but at the same time, actually make use of them. That the idea of ownership becomes, and who owns and who benefits, becomes problematic when you have these profit maximising, cost minimising machines that humans have created called corporations, which go and get some, if you like, potentially valuable intellectual property of Indigenous people on the other side of the world, take it back up to a laboratory, make a product, and then sell that at great profit. That is very different from someone finding some heirloom seed that they got given by someone that had come from that similar source, and then they are doing with it what people have always done, exchange and do things for themselves at a small scale. So I think a lot of those problems about cultural appropriation are to do with scale and the monetarization of things. Sorry, that's a long answer to, I mean, it's a very complex question, I suppose.
Yes, I think it's very helpful, and it reminds me that part of the critiques of permaculture, which I think are, very reasonable to name and address, in my context in North America, may show up out of the monetization of the permaculture design certificate training experience as being something that is potentially elitist or expensive, or some of those things. It's not true all over, but that does happen, and so that could be one of the reasons.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I suppose the other thing of the reality of working in a society where monetarized economy has become so dominant, that one of the reactions against that is to say, okay, we must start on a completely different basis, and information is actually a sort of a common and recreate the commons, so actually knowledge and teaching is something that actually doesn't have a price on it. All those things might be good in as an ideal, but of course the reality of experience of people who live from their own work as self-employed people and as small entrepreneurs know from experience how almost no one puts value on something unless it has a price on it. And that other countervailing experience of how embedded the whole society is in using money as the measure of all things. So how do we start to rebuild that? The place that starts is at the household level. So for example, with that child rearing thing, we sort of advocate, no pocket money, no paid work doing things in the household economy, but children experimenting with small enterprise, learning how money works in small ways, that producing something that is surplus to the household through their own efforts and actually selling it is a great way of how one puts one's toes in the water of that monetary world and learns how it works, but learns how it works at its essence, where it actually has value or where its damage and risks are least. So trying to sort of then separate that money is something outside of the household, inside of the household we work in another way. And I think we need to be working at lots of different levels, but certainly over the decades, we've seen a lot of people, of course, come from very radical ideas and idealistic ideas saying we're going to sort of reset everything. We're going to start at a ground zero and redesign all relationships, and everyone is equal. And I suppose with our experience of that over the decades is that it's just as important as those ideas is to acknowledge differences of power, differences of capacity. And our unwillingness to do that is part of the problem as much as those imbalances of power. So we see that as very core in this idea of people taking people into their houses. We think that at least middle-class Australians don't do this, even though it's to their economic advantage to do so, and social advantage and all sorts of advantages. People say, oh, well, my privacy is really important to me. But I think there's also aspects of an unwillingness to come face to face with differences in power. So, because certainly in Australian society, we like to think of ourselves as all equal. Of course, we're not. And when you have someone sharing your house and you are the owner of the house, well, you develop some sort of degree of intimacy in that relationship. And if that relationship, for you, for whatever reason, doesn't work out and you need to say, oh, look, at the end of your tenancy, I'd like you to leave, that is incredibly distasteful to middle-class perceptions that we're all equal, because then you are coming face to face with that you have power that this other person doesn't. And I think that stepping stone of coming to recognise power and own that is actually a critical step in evolution beyond whatever dysfunctions there are in that. And it's the denial of those sorts of things, in the same way denying that it's actually fossil fuels that have created all this wealth around us, not how smart we are. To acknowledge that power that we've gained from all these things, rather than just saying, oh, those fossil fuels are bad. We now want all the same thing, but we want it to be clean and climate friendly. So a lot of permaculture is actually about getting back connected to our sources of sustenance, getting back to understand what is actually going on,
Mhm.
deal with that reality
Mhm.
in a small way that we can then sort of evolve from where we are rather than denying where we are. And, there's definitely a role for the radical experiment. The biggest wind turbine of its time was built at the Tvind community in Denmark in the 1970s with gender-balanced work teams chanting slogans from Mao's Little Red Book. And it was actually bigger and more successful turbine than anything that NASA had built as a research turbine, and was actually one of the points that led to Denmark actually becoming the centre of the explosion of the wind industry. I mean, there were a whole lot of other factors also that led to little Denmark being that centre. But so I'm definitely in favour of people, of radical experimentation, but it's also really important to work the other way of saying, where are we? How do we actually face that, audit that, and then say, okay, how do we tweak and move from that rather than denying where we are?
So moving from denial to with recognizing, acknowledging privilege and power, and then from that point developing the patterns that could then aggregate to be transformative to society. So the place for that is who permaculture advocates for is really at a personal and household scale. But if we want to see a next economy or a transformation of the economy, it would be built from, it will grow from these patterns of functional self-reliance at a much smaller scale. Given places for, well, actually on that note, just because I'm so close to Silicon Valley where I sit today on this call, there's this fetish for technology. And I've heard you mention appropriate technology in interesting contexts that many people don't think of. Maybe these are some of the experiments, but you've even mentioned, some of the more interesting technology around today. Even the crop protection from tree planting, these types of, there is some very interesting technology that has developed, and these are interesting experiments or interesting contributions, but not often in the same type of way in which technology is thought. I'm wondering if maybe you could comment on a few technologies that you think are worthwhile to consider that are maybe remnants that we can scavenge from the energy ascent that are interesting.
Yeah, well, there's so many where we don't need to look at whether something is sustainable in some sort of perpetual sense, that it may be some sort of opportunistic activity. I mean, the example I would give related to one of the most popular techniques that became popularized through permaculture is sheet mulch gardening, where people instantly start a garden by using huge amounts of organic material to smother out existing grasses and perennial weeds and build a garden on top of it, rather than digging all those weeds out and throwing those away and trying to get the soil in some sort of condition. And of course, what that depends on is huge amounts of organic material waste, which in a traditional society, agrarian society before industrialization, was not available, because everything was either feed for animals or fuel for heating or whatever. Surplus organic material finally chopped up and sort of provided is sort of a byproduct of industrial system. So in that sense, it's not in any way sustainable, but it's a scavenging off the wastes of a system which is wasteful. And it's exploiting that to help create or start a system which then might not be dependent on that in a perpetual cycle. So the creative reuse aspects of permaculture, in my relatively limited travels around the world looking at permaculture projects, is that creative reuse is almost the most universal theme I've come across, more than ecological agriculture and gardening, and ecological and natural building, or various forms of community organisation. It'd be creative reuse. And so there's a huge opportunity, which is at a staggering scale, to work out how to take a particular source material that may be just available at one place at one time and reuse it. What people often call upscaling, and, so many ways in which this is now becoming more fashionable. But when we move up into the industrial level, it's enormous. The amount of complex technology that just gets thrown in the tip because there's no one in a position that has the technical knowledge or the time or the ability to reuse that. So beyond the domestic, there's this enormous amount of technology that's being dumped. In our country, we can see it now happening with solar photovoltaics off roofs, of inverters and panels being dumped, that there isn't a creative, skilled reuse industry, because everything is focused on the new. So, of course, that's how, we try to create the solutions, and the mainstream economy turns the back into the same problem. So I think that creative reuse is sort of obviously at the skill and creativity level more than the technology, but it obviously involves using a lot of technology. We can see in computers with diagnostic equipment that you can actually work out, how to fix something up or put something together. In other ways, there's obviously the information economies and the potential for that come through sharing economies, I think are really important, but we also don't understand how much the systems that sustain that, the infrastructure that sustains that of the internet, apart from being dependent on 24/7 electricity and various other things, we don't know how, because that has evolved so rapidly in a particular context. There's evidence that systems that evolve new aspects or structures, when those systems go into contraction, the most recently evolved bits are the bits that fall off first. And the deep core functions of a system are kept. So by that principle, if society are going through energy descent, the internet could be one of the first things to actually become dysfunctional, even though from many perspectives, this doesn't inherently use a lot of energy. This is, surely society could sort of keep these things together. So I think that those questions are still open about how much we invest all of our eggs in the basket of having this instantaneous sort of connection between people across time and space, while again saying it's there, use it, as we are doing, right at this minute. So that, balance, but there's a lot more very prosaic things. I mean, I'd give a rural example, which is critical in permaculture. Electric fencing uses tiny amounts of electricity and uses half the materials necessary. It's an animal training system, and it allows us to more effectively move animals on land in rural environments according to the land form and shape, rather than big straight lines determined by the simple technology of strained fences needing to be in straight lines. So that simple technology is actually really transformative in the way it allows us to manage land. Now, you could say, well, this is a substitute for a thing that existed in the past called shepherding. And then, of course, we can combine those, as people are doing now with digital shepherds who have got electronic ear tags on stock and electric fences, and they're moving animals around using them for vegetation management as an alternative to employing Monsanto. And that sort of is an interesting example of where there's this hybrid between, yes, state-of-the-art modern technology and very old practices and ways of doing things that we had in the past, where people moved mobs of animals around to sort of keep grass under control and reduce fire hazard in places like California and Australia. So I think there's a huge spectrum in permaculture where we can make use of technology, but always trying to not be critically dependent on very complex systems that are manufactured in clean room manufacturing on the other side of the world that may or may not be available in the future. Not just because of, is there the energy to run those factories? Is there the international agreement to allow those ships to travel? And of course we're moving into a world already where those things may stop because of the breakdown in trust in the so-called benefits of globalization. So we lose those benefits of globalization at the same time that we will find there's opportunities to gain benefits from relocalization. And I think there's always going to be, that mix, in the same way that we can critique the destructive things about globalization at the same time that we are here benefiting, from those things. So just recognizing those changes and how we move creatively with those changes, rather than believing we can define what will be sustainable, in perpetuity, which is partly, of course, what the title of my book, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, was to go beyond that idea that we can sustain what we have, but more we need to, move creatively with what's available, but be prepared to discard what no longer works when it no longer works.
Well, I'm appreciative of the kind of pathway to a world beyond sustainability, a regenerative kind of human presence in all your work, which includes, for those listeners who are not aware of your books, Permaculture 1, RetroSuburbia, Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, Future Scenarios, and an amazing collection of papers, which is one of my favorite resources that you've put into the world, which is available on your website, www.holmgren.com.au. Did I get it right?
Yep,
yeah,
that's right.
Yeah,
and we're working at the moment on a facsimile ebook edition of Permaculture 1. Again, it will be available because it's a rare book these days, and there's a third edition of the collected writings.
The collected writings, great.
Yeah, which will draw together a lot of those papers and essays since the second edition was done. And RetroSuburbia, we are working on the ebook version because it is a great tome, and I'm sure some people would be interested in having it in that form. So we're doing all those things, and of course the way we do those things, we try and model what we're on about. The RetroSuburbia book was printed in Australia, a rare thing these days, instead of printing in China, and it was supported by crowdfunding. And of course also our book distribution works in the United States in partnership with Permaculture Design Mag and our partners here, Richard Telford at Permaculture Principles doing distribution, and our book is not available on Amazon. So we have broken the mold, even though almost everyone in the book trade, even the most progressive publishers, say, oh no, you can't do that. It's not possible to do it. So RetroSuburbia, works through that direct distribution system and network that we've established. So although I've been talking about, obviously, the non-monetary economy, we are in our small ways try and model the same ideas in our efforts to get these ideas out there and provide livelihoods for people doing that work, which is, I think, an important part of the process as well.
Thanks for modeling that. I'm curious if you have any last, for this interview, any anything that I didn't ask, or any thoughts that you might have that you think our listeners might benefit from or value, with parting thoughts, if you will?
Well, I think clearly the larger changes happening in the world are sort of moving very, very fast. And I think the recognizing that people of goodwill who are concerned about an equitable and better world need to be, while they think about the larger, also need to be definitely thinking about the smaller. And as I found traveling, doing public presentations in 2014 with Nicole Foss about the economy, she said she was so concerned that people of goodwill who were doing things that would help community hold together were to some extent ignorant of their own financial vulnerability as the current system unravels. And sort of so finding that balance between looking at how we model larger changes and how we defensively look after our own interests, not in a way that's against the interests of the rest of society, but doesn't take for granted that the current systems that sustain us and the current sources of wealth, whether that's in people's houses or their superannuation, that any of those things will necessarily exist. And that there's no knowing how that unfolds, but I think it's very productive to assume that those things don't exist, act like they don't exist, and it's a much better space to be in rather than being unconsciously dependent on all of those things. Because I think the world is now moving very, very fast, and very creative things can come out of crisis, but they are also sort of a huge reset, filter and constraint on what people can do. And at the moment, we're in an incredible free space to act. So acting boldly in that space, I think, is an opportunity.
Seize the moment while we have it to increase independence or interdependence from this dependence on these larger systems. Well, thank you for holding a torch for that message for so many years, when it has times, because of constraints, come into vogue and come out of vogue, but consistently you and permaculture have held this amazing through line for, as in future scenarios, everything points to this value of local and personal self-reliance, interdependence, really, too. There's a community scale to it.
But we often say self and collective reliance.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Well, I want to also thank you for framing permaculture and this provocation around, acknowledging the sources of this, and also this small and slow, this pattern things that work if we want to transform if we have this desire to transform all of society or all of the economy, really turning to where we have agency is something I think you'll have to tell me if I was wrong about this, but I remember asking you what's the most pithy way to describe permaculture, I think, and I believe you said remembering ourselves as nature, and it really resonated with me. You know, that's some of the great work of our time. So thank you for that.
Great to join you on the Next Economy Now.
Thanks, David.